Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the range of reason on inference and its consequences. This workshop outlines a new rationalist conception of reason that resists postmodern critique and Bayesian dissolution alike. Deploying a collection of texts written over more than 15 years, it presents an integrated philosophical perspective that delves into the epistemic, semantic, and logical mysteries of inference and extrapolates their metaphysical, aesthetic, and ethical consequences. Lectures will explore theoretical tendencies such as Prometheanism, Inhumanism, and Computationalism. Pete, you can start.
Okay, right. Thank you all for joining me on this course. For anyone who doesn't know, I gave the first ever lecture at the New Centre like 12 years ago. Um, and I've done several in between, and I always make the same characteristic mistake, which is I try and cram the lecture too full, and then there doesn't end up being enough time for discussion afterwards. And I'm going to endeavour not to do that on this course. And the fact that we've got 8 sessions should hopefully mean that we can have like a nice sort of slow feed of stuff. Inevitably, my own inclinations will shine through, and I'll try and squeeze too much in, but fight back against it, please. Because I am genuinely interested in getting your thoughts and feedback. Because this course is also very unlike other ones I've taught before, in that I am essentially just teaching my own book. And it's a thing that already exists. Um, and so can be read and criticized. Um, um, Now, the book itself is unusual as well because um, it's not an integrated text so much as sort of evidence of a trajectory of thought and progress. Um, all of the essays are interrelated in a variety of different ways, but it's not necessarily made explicit completely in the text how everything hangs together. And my hope in this course is to try and do that, to try and sort of make explicit how all of these things hang together as a sort of systematic perspective. Um, but that is a kind of, again, a work in progress, right? And so getting your feedback and criticisms and seeing your discussion and how you engage with the ideas is going to be really helpful to me and my philosophical journey as it carries on. Um, so, um, um, every week there's going to be um, at least one sort of set reading from the text and at least one optional reading. Again, optional, you don't have to do it, but it might um, add some additional context. Um, I'm going to do my best not simply to repeat the readings in the lecture, but to try and again like recontextualize, problematize where I see aspects of my thought are kind of incomplete or need further work, um, and just generally refigure. Um, in this first lecture, the um, text that I set was the first essay in the collection, Prometheanism and Rationalism, which I think in some ways lays out the motivation for the line of thought that's um, uh, represented by the first sort of five essays, the chunk of the book that goes under the subtitle "The Demands of Thought." Um, so what I'm going to try and do now is to oh, um, um, rework some of those concerns from um, that essay, and indeed the optional text I set, which was an interview on philosophy and normativity, in a way that hopefully points in the direction that my work is going in. Um, and that will hopefully enable us to fill in and the kind of initial promissory note as we go through. Right. We'll get to any of the other bureaucratic stuff after the lecture. I'm just going to start. Um, my aim, by the way, is to lecture for an hour and then have a break and then have an hour or more of discussion. Um, uh, let's see if I can keep to that. Right, let me just share this. Um, share. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. So, lecture one, Neorationalism and outline. I thought I'd start with the question, what is philosophy? Um, I have a very particular take on this, but I like to start with uh, two more well-known takes. So Wilfrid Sellars, who's big influence on my work, once said, "The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term." Under things in the broadest possible sense, I include such radically different items as not only cabbages and kings, but numbers and duties, possibilities and finger snaps, aesthetic experience and death. To achieve success in philosophy would be, to use a contemporary turn of phrase, to know one's way around with respect to all these things, not in that unreflective way in which the centipede of the story knew its way around before it faced the question, how do I walk? But in the reflective way, which means that no intellectual holds are barred. Um, um, I think this is a sort of wonderful aspirational definition of philosophy. But it kind of presents a sort of picture of philosophy as a kind of product, right? A sort of the end result is to, in some sense, know everything, right? Not necessarily know everything in detail, but there's some kind of relation to the whole, right? Conversely, a much more famous definition, which comes from Socrates and Plato's Apology. Although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. This is sometimes paraphrased as, all that I know is that I know nothing. Right? Um, so Socrates articulates um, the love of wisdom in terms of a certain kind of ignorance. Right? Um, and this is a more processual conception of philosophy, right? As a process, right? And I would characterize this process as um, a kind of refinement of ignorance, right? Ignorance is a sort of positive, virtuous thing, right? Rather than simply the absence of knowledge, right? As so to put it in other terms, like one of the interesting things is one can know what one doesn't know, right? And one can know more about what one doesn't know, right? The knowledge of nothing, in this sense, can be expanded and refined and developed. And I think these present sort of two sides of the same coin, knowing everything, knowing nothing. There's this refinement of our ability to inquire and learn, right? To figure our way around within the space of possible knowledge and inquiry. Now, the way I like to cash this out is I will say philosophy is the art of asking questions, right? Let me unpack that a bit further. So, there are some questions that are obviously non-philosophical, right? So I've got some examples here, like in mathematics, is there a largest prime number, right? We know there isn't, we've got a proof of it, nothing to do with philosophy, right? Physics, is there a smallest particle? More contentious, right? Politics, what's the best system of government? Art, is Tarantino a true author, right? These are questions that we think they're not philosophical questions, but philosophical questions do arise from these, right? Even those subjects, such as physics, which at one point emerged from philosophy, physics was originally kind of natural philosophy before becoming codified, right? Still contain implicit within them a philosophical dimension insofar as we can ask clarifying questions about the questions of physics, right? So, for example, one might want to ask, well, what is a particle? What is force, right? What is symmetry, right? There are these questions that become philosophy of physics. Right? Similarly, we can have philosophy of mathematics. What are numbers, right? What is a proof, right? Philosophy of politics. What even is government, right? What is authority? Questions like this. And philosophy of art. What is cinema, right? So even as out of the kind of protean inquisitiveness of the human, mind gets sort of progressively refined and split into distinct subjects with distinct, concepts and distinct areas of inquiry. There is still this kind of philosophical residue that ties it all together. And this sort of invites the question, are there any questions that are quintessentially philosophical that are left over? Right? That is not simply philosophy of, but are philosophy per se. Right? And I think, if nothing else, we can always ask, well, what is a question? Right? What actually are we doing here in this? And that, at the very least, right, delineates a certain range of subjects that are specifically philosophical. Here I've put like logic, semantics, epistemology, like the study of the nature of thought and inquiry, right, are characteristically philosophical, right? But we might also want to say that questioning is a practical, ethical orientation, right? Like questions of like which questions you should ask, right? That's essentially ethical, right? If nothing else, right? And you've already quoted Sellers here. How do all of these things hang together? Well, you might want to say that metaphysics, right, as a discipline, has some important role within that task of unifying these various different subjects. We'll talk about that more a few sessions from now. I don't want to kind of over-determine what metaphysics is for now, but like again, right, we can we can we can see that there is a sort of room for philosophy per se. Yeah. Um, um, this also opens up the question of types of philosophy. And I want to sort of throw in a few adjectives here. So, first of all, systematic philosophy. This is near and dear to my heart. Um, um, to follow Sellers here, I think really what systematic philosophy is tracing the relationship between the different kinds of questions we can ask in such a way that we can unify the answers. We can present a kind of like parsimonious and perspicuous model of things. Um, um, there are plenty of systematic philosophers, but there's also plenty of philosophy that isn't systematic. And I think this is a kind of weakness of a lot of contemporary analytic philosophy, is a sort of just unwillingness to try and see how, semantics and aesthetics are related, for instance, right? Um, there's a sort of feeling that you can just work within one domain and you don't have to, potentially open yourself up to conceptual developments in other spaces. Similarly, critical philosophy, right, comes from Kant, though there's plenty of people who would characterize themselves as critical. I would characterize this as delineating the conditions of questions and questioning, right? Articulating and examining the conditions under which it makes sense to ask certain kinds of questions. And on that basis, identifying pseudo problems, right? So in Kant, this is, Kant clearly delineates, look, there are these traditional philosophical problems to which there can be solutions on the basis of the sort of like analytic, the sensibility and understanding. And then, look, there are these other questions that the structure of reason invites us to ask, but which there simply can't be any answer to. Right? Kant's not the only philosopher who does this. To give an example of a non-systematic philosopher who you could call critical in these terms, Wittgenstein, right? Wittgenstein, basically wants to say, well, all philosophical problems are pseudo problems. Once we understand the language games that we're operating within, we see that they kind of dissolve, right? Um, um, uh, I'm pro-critical philosophy, but again, you have to be kind of critical in a critical way. Um, I think um, um, you can't dissolve all problems this way, right? It's very, very important not to have a kind of universal acid. Um, um, Finally, dialectical philosophy. This is going to be the most controversial because no two people can agree on what the meaning of the word dialectical is. I have a very minimal view of this, which kind of comes from Socrates and Plato rather than simply like Hegel and Marx. Um, um, Crucially, the dialectical always refers to the dialogical, right? The kind of Socratic method of sort of mutual inquiry and questioning and challenging, in which definitions are put forward and their implications are teased out until they're revealed to be contradictory, at which point the definition must be discarded and a new one must be put forward. This kind of dialogical process of definitional development, right? What I've called here chasing definitions beyond their limits, right? And importantly, learning to ask better questions, right? So the key thing, and I'll emphasize this more, various points, is that we are capable of asking questions which we can get answers to that tell us the question has been poorly formed, right? And we need to rethink the very way in which we're articulating and asking them, right? Not simply like rejecting as a pseudo problem, but refining, right? And I think this is philosophically key, but not just philosophically key. I think this is a sort of essential characteristic of sapiens. But we'll get to that. Now, the real legacy of dialectical philosophy is Plato's legacy. And I think there are a couple significant ideas from Plato that I want to just start with before I get into questions about Prometheanism and rationalism and whatnot. The first key idea in Plato, which is key, I think, for myself and also probably my fellow neorationalists, Reza Negrestani and Ray Brassier, is what you might call the autonomy of reason. This idea that kind of reason has to be understood on its own terms. Plato takes this very far, probably too far, right? But it's worth starting with him here. I think there are sort of two significant strands to this. The first is mathematics. I think one of the key elements of Platonism is the recognition of mathematical knowledge as a kind of paradigm. Like if we know anything, right, we know that pi is irrational, right? If we know anything, we know Pythagoras' theory. Like if you want to understand what knowledge is, start with that which we have the most certainty in. And this doesn't mean that empirical knowledge, knowledge of things that aren't mathematical facts, mathematical objects or whatever, has to be understood as exactly like them, right? There can be crucial differences, but the kind of purchase that mathematics gives us on knowledge is a sort of starting point. And crucially, the key thing about mathematical knowledge is that it doesn't require any appeal to the world. There's no appeal to perception or any kind of contingent fact, right? Mathematical proofs stand on their own, right? And this is a sort of exemplar of this autonomy of reason, right? The other key thing, I think, goes back beyond Plato to Socrates. So what's kind of the crux of Socrates' conflict and victory over the sophists is his insistence that thought is a craft, right? And what this means is it's something that can be done well or badly, right? It's something that has normative standards that are not simply social conventions, right? This is like techne versus nomos, right? And again, this is the other side of this idea of a kind of autonomy of reason, that there's, even if the social practices of discussing and engaging in argument and whatnot are things that we've sort of agreed on or instantiated or instituted ourselves, right? There's something about them that can take us beyond the decisions and choices we made in instituting them, right? We can kind of create games whose implications no one can anticipate in advance, right? And indeed, I think this is what's at the core of this sort of dialectical dimension of philosophy, in that we can start out with kind of, definitions that we've stipulated, right? And yet, through the processes of working through them and engaging in this kind of like characteristically dialogical way, um, uh, those definitions can give way to others and revise in a way that reaches for something that is outside of what we started with, right? So another way I've put this here is there's a kind of crucial difference between word and idea, right? The word that we have a certain kind of language game for using, right, can, in the process of our using and engaging, change, and the direction of that change points at something beyond it. Right? Um, 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 so a good example of this is the idea of space in mathematics. Right? So there are various different definitions of space, right? In geometry, topology, there are different kinds of spaces, right? And different more or less general frameworks. So you can point set topology or pointless topology or Grothendieck topology, right? Going through like increasingly rarefied forms of abstraction. But none of these definitions, none of these specific frameworks exhausts the notion of space. Like rather, like the progressive development of these increasingly more general frameworks is a kind of like historical narrativization of the unfolding of the idea, right, of it. That's an image I hope you can, well, it's an example I hope you can get and we can come back to as we go. Um, um, what's wrong in Plato? So there's an idea that me and Ray came up with many years ago, which we called the Platonic knot. We meant to write a paper on it and never did. But basically the idea is this. Plato is great insofar as he comes up with this like conception of the autonomy of reason as separate from the so the intelligible from the sort of sensible world, right? Um, and then he makes the mistake of tying them back together um, by founding the sensible upon the intelligible, right? By having the ideas be the actual causes of things within the world. Um, um, I mean, this is conceived in Plato in terms of perfection, right? So the ideas are the kind of exemplars of which sensible things in the world are kind of pale imitations, imperfect copies. And this kind of causes a lot of bad consequences. In particular, what I would argue is that sort of like Aristotle takes this and then runs with it. And what we get is a kind of full teleological conception of nature within which like you can like I mean what Aristotle does is to kind of make this empiricist and sort of say, well, actually, if you look at nature and you study nature, you can find the way things are supposed to be. Like, you can find the sort of ideal structures inherent, like the final causes. And yeah, teleology and normative naturalism lead to very bad consequences, and we'll talk about this more later. I think the sort of not the only, but the positive dimension of the Platonic tradition that I really want to pick up and run with is this sort of the concept of the idea and the way in which it gets developed from Plato to Kant to Hegel and even a figure like Alain Badiou. You can see it's kind of like giving us a Platonist theory of ideas. I'm oh, you've got a hand up.
Yeah. Is it okay if I ask a question now, or should we maybe wait for the discussion?
If it's a clarificatory question, go for it.
Yeah. So when you were talking about this kind of historical unfolding of the idea, I'm not sure I fully understand. Because one way you can think about it as well is if you start with a folk notion of space, and then you move to topological spaces and vector spaces, you could say, well, this is a more general notion of space, or you could also say we're not talking about the same thing anymore. Like it seems to me like it's very a kind of abstract mathematical space is very different from what I have in mind when I'm moving from one place to another. So it's really not clear. Like I'm pretty certain you don't want to say that there's a kind of teleology that every concept will tend towards its full realization. So it's not clear to me what is going on here with this historical unfolding.
Maybe we should come back to this in discussion
Okay.
because it's a good question, and I think the initial challenge that why can't we just say we're talking about something different here? Or why do we have to say this is a kind of consistent object across these? I think that's a really good and worthy challenge. But let's come back to it in discussion. There's someone else has a quick question.
Yeah, I would like to ask, what do you think about the concepts of speculative philosophy? Because when you were showing the types of semantic, critical, and dialectical philosophy, immediately came to mind the type of philosophy that I am most that I read the most, that I'm more influenced by, which is through the William James and Alfred North Whitehead conception of what is this speculative endeavor, which for me it seems like a kind of combination between systematic and dialectical philosophy, especially if we take this dialectical conception of philosophy in this more um, um, oh, I forgot the word, in the conception that the more minimalist conception that you were uh, showing us
So
here.
so I tried to avoid using the term speculative just because precisely there is a significant overlap here. And also it's sometimes used sometimes people use it to mean the same thing as dialectical philosophy as in Hegel, right? And sometimes people use it to mean like non-critical. Like which again someone like Hegel might dispute, right? So I think often what distinguishes speculative philosophy is some combination of these three things, but there's no kind of clear agreement on which of those it has to be. And that's just why I've um, not not deployed it. Um, like if we're saying speculative philosophy is systematic, critical, and dialectical, sign me up for it, right? Um, but um, yeah, um, right. So that's my kind of initial preamble. I can already see I'm going to take way too long here. If people do have clarificatory questions, do feel free to come in. I'm going to try and speed up through here. So anyway, I have sort of three actual questions that I want to deal with here. The first is coming out of the reading. what's the relationship between Prometheanism and rationalism, right? And I think this leads us to the question, what's the relationship between reason and freedom? And this in turn leads us to the question of what's the relation between the causal and the normative, right? To begin with Prometheanism and rationalism, I actually sort of define Prometheanism in two different ways in the paper. I start off by defining it as a political attitude as opposed to sort of messianism and fatalism. To one of three possible attitudes to the future, right? And essentially it's defined as interventionism, right? Embracing a historical agency, investigating tendencies and their possible outcomes, and committing to a politics of intervention, as opposed to a politics of amelioration or political ritual, right? But later on, I develop, and I don't develop, I just steal this from Ray Brassier, a more general conception of Prometheanism as a kind of general practical orientation, right? And this you might characterize as empowerment, right? So Prometheanism is defined as the rejection of predetermined limits upon action and self-transformation, right? Um, um, I also then discuss some specific contemporary forms of Prometheanism, left accelerationism, and xenofeminism, which I'm going to leave to the next slide. The key thing is I define rationalism in a way that is sort of parallel to this definition of Prometheanism. It's this rejection of predetermined limits upon thought and self-understanding, right? And this is a way of cashing out this idea of kind of reason's autonomy. The idea that what predetermined limits here means is limits that are not themselves imposed by reason itself, right? And reason does impose limits upon itself, right? My favorite example of this is like Gödel's theorems, right? We like Gödel's theorems are reason demonstrating intrinsic limits to what can be proved, right? Proving the limits of proof. Very good idea of sort of a kind of critical rationalism, right? Now, what I say in the paper, and this is like fairly obvious, is that defined this way, Prometheanism entails rationalism, right? So if you reject predetermined limits on action and self-transformation, you have to reject predetermined limits upon thought and self-understanding, right? Because limits upon thought and self-understanding are limits upon action and self-transformation. The kind of sneakier thing that I sort of suggest towards the end of the paper, which kind of points in the direction of where the rest of the essays go, is that maybe rationalism entails Prometheanism, right? Maybe, um, maybe if we are truly rationalist, we inevitably, or rather should really be Promethean in this sort of deep sense. But how do we show that entailment? Now, before I get into that, I just thought I'd very briefly flash up left accelerationism and xenofeminism, because I'm sure some people are interested in this stuff, maybe not everybody. These are my sort of very pithy definitions of left accelerationism and xenofeminism. The sort of key features that I bring out, I would like to sort of point out is sort of left accelerationism, I think, is rather than a sort of techno-optimism, it's a kind of techno-opportunism. And it's fundamentally built around this kind of conception of positive freedom, which Williams and Zernacek call synthetic freedom in their non-accelerationist book. Xenofeminism, I think its key feature, and this is like something which I'm completely dedicated to 100%, is normative antinaturalism, is this kind of rejection of the Platonic knot and the sort of Aristotelian history that follows it. But there's also this really interesting idea of alienation as an emancipatory force. This idea of like sort of being alienated from ourselves as a kind of process of self-construction, right? And that's something we're going to come back to. Reason and freedom. So here's my so the other text I set was the introduction to the book, and there I have a kind of definition of what neorationalism is, which is to reject all rational intuition in the name of reason, to insist that not only is there no intuitive faculty of rational knowledge, but that there's no intuitive purchase on reason's own structure, possibilities, and limits, right? Reason is not what you think it is. Reason is not rationalization. Reason is not reasonable. I'm still really happy with this. It's really pithy, but like you might want to ask me specifically what do I mean by a few of the things that are said here. So I thought I'd unpack this a little. And this is a sort of negative way of looking at reason, but I think it may be useful at least oppositionally, right? So first of all, reason is not revelation. And this is crucially one of the things that distinguishes neorationalism from classical rationalism, right? From rationalism that has a notion of kind of rational intuition. Like fundamentally, we think that reason shouldn't be conceived intuitively. And I'd say this is something that affects not just a thinker like Descartes or Spinoza, but also even someone like Hegel. And we'll come back to this in a few sessions, but I think Hegel's conception of the sort of pure dialectic ultimately is too intuitive, right? Secondly, reason is not rationalization. I think this is kind of contra postmodern critiques of reason. I use the term postmodern just as a kind of handy group, but I know it's contentious. But you will find these kinds of critiques ranging from, say, like Paul Feyerabend, right? Technically in the analytic philosophy of science, who wrote a book called Have Done with Reason. Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, basically saying reason's just this kind of word that Westerners throw about to exercise power within colonial contexts, right? It's just a kind of signifier of authority, right? And you can see that also played out in, you know, deconstruction and various lines of thought downstream from it, right, within the continental tradition. Here there is a tendency to treat the capacity of and again like this is what I was characterizing as like the overextension of critical philosophy, this sort of like um, um, examining the conditions under which we can engage within questions like questions about what's truth, what's true, what's just, right? In such a way that every attempt to answer them is revealed as simply a kind of naked exercise of power or the sort of rationalization of an existing form of authority. Um, um, this kind of critique is important, but it can't destroy the object that it's aiming at, right? or it's important for it not to do that, in my view. So anyway, the tricky thing, so another way of characterizing rationalization here is it's kind of like post hoc justification, like not acting in accordance with reason, but kind of using reason to justify what one already wants to do. It's very hard to understand the boundary between rationalization and reasoning. I think it's maybe an underappreciated problem, but I'll talk about that more another time. Crucially, reason is also not reasonableness, and I see this as a sort of rejection of what I call proceduralism. This is kind of most obvious in people like Rawls and Habermas. This idea that kind of reason is about consensus, right? Like whatever the consensus is the right answer, right? That's the kind of democratic thinking that Plato was so radically hostile to. And again, like, not going to go all the way with Plato there, but rejecting the idea that truth is in consensus is, I think, very important. Finally, reason is about revision. And this is something that's going to be a kind of core theme throughout all of this, that like what kind of really characterizes reason is this kind of capacity for revision, both in the theoretical and the practical sphere, right? But this revision shouldn't be understood in the way in which Bayesians understand it. So there's a whole other kind of wing of rationalism popular online, centered around kind of less wrong, and maybe the effective altruism communities, like Eliza Yudkowsky is probably the most famous. These guys think reason is exhausted by Bayesian inference and decision theory, and I think they're wrong about that. They agree with me on the other three things, but we disagree over precisely how to understand the revisionary character of reason. Okay. What's freedom? I'm not going to give the sort of final form of the definition here, but I think it's worth thinking about freedom in two different dimensions, so at least two different dimensions. One is causal autonomy. So this is fundamentally Spinoza's conception of freedom. That's basically being self-caused. Right? This is how Spinoza understands freedom. It's not about being undetermined, but it's about being determined in the right way, which is to say, by one's own essence. This incorporates a certain notion of capacity, like having abilities to act, but also a certain conception of liberty, like not being determined by others, right? This is, well, crucially, this is the kind of dimension of freedom that I think left accelerationism sort of focuses on in this development of the notion of synthetic freedom. On the other hand, there is normative autonomy. And this is more what we see in Kant. This is not not it's not about causal necessity. It's rather about normative necessity. What that means is basically that one isn't governed by any obligations that one does not commit oneself to. Right? You have to be kind of normatively autonomous is to give the law unto oneself, to choose what principles bind you, right? And that's not an infinite authority, right? Like when you undertake commitments, the consequences of those commitments might exceed your understanding of, right? You might commit yourself to things that you don't really fully get, or you don't necessarily want to be after the fact, but there's still got to be this sense in which you have committed yourself. There can't be sort of an independent Like for instance, a natural law, right? Um, Xenofeminism's commitment to sort of normative anti-naturalism is absolutely of a piece with this, but more than this, the attempt to kind of see sort of selfhood as this kind of like um, inherently artificial process of self-construction um, is an attempt to kind of put meat on the bones of that. Um, um, hmm, I was going to say something about modernity, but I'm going to leave that to a future lecture. Um, there's often this question, okay, left accelerationism, what is being accelerated? And I would argue it's modernity conceived as a certain kind of tendency, a certain kind of autocatalytic um, um, process of sort of self-ratcheting freedom or emancipation or empowerment. Precisely how to understand that, which and how it weaves together these two different dimensions, I'm going to defer to later. Um, right. Um, how does this lead us to causality and normativity? Well, I've already said, these causal and normative notions of autonomy and the correlated notions of causal necessity and normative necessity are essential for understanding freedom, right? Um, so um, we want to kind of dig in deeper. I also want to um, add in the sort of Salazian way of framing this question of how the causal and the normative are related. Um, um, and okay, let me do it in two ways. One, I've already kind of put forward this idea of this Platonic knot, right? Um, the question of how to properly relate causality and normativity is essentially how do we kind of untie and re-articulate that in a way that doesn't lead to normative naturalism. Um, the Salazian way of framing this is in terms of what he'd call the relation between the space of causes and the space of reasons. Right? How is the space of reasons, right? The space we enter as rational agents engaging in discourse, right? This kind of the game of giving and asking for reasons, right? And it's kind of like uh, relative autonomy. How do we understand that in relation to the space of causes that we are enmeshed in as like actual physical biological creatures, right? Um, so what causality? I'm not going to say what is causality here because that's a whole other question, right? Deeper metaphysics there, but what kind of causality are we interested in? I've got sort of like three qualifiers here. One, pragmatism. I'd say it's important to recognize that reason is incarnated in the world. Um, this is because reason is something that is done, right? Inference, right, is a practice that we're engaging in, right? We are drawing conclusions and challenging them in this game of giving and asking for reasons, right? Um, so it's something in the world, right? And that's again something that classical rationalism didn't properly articulate or appreciate. Secondly, we have to acknowledge a certain amount of empiricism. Reason interacts with the world, right? There are certain ways in which the game of giving and asking for reasons is constrained, right, by crucially perception. Right? The information we get from our environment is a key feature of crucial parts of the game of reason, like everything anything to do with the empirical world and talking about it. Um, Thirdly, though, these causal structures of incarnation and interaction can be abstracted, right? We can we can provide abstract functional analyses of these causal processes, right? as forms of computation, right? Here's the more difficult question. What is normativity? So there are many different types of norm, like ethical, cultural, legal, rational. Let me give you some examples. Like you shouldn't kill people. That's an ethical norm. Uh, you should eat with a fork on the left if you're in England, right? That's a cultural norm. Um, uh, a rational norm. You shouldn't contradict yourself, right? Technological norms, anything like a specification, right, for how, say, like a DVD player is supposed to work, right? It's a kind of technological norm, right? And biological norms, a bit more complicated, but the idea that the heart should beat, right? The heart should pump blood around the body is a kind of norm, right, or normative principle, at least insofar as it's functional, right? Um, One important thing to understand, and this is something which often causes confusion in debates about this stuff, is that um, um, normativity does not mean normality. Um, so to give you some like very basic examples of this, like and again, here's a biological one. A an acorn, in some important sense, should grow into a tree. That's its purpose, right? But the vast majority of acorns never do, right? Um, um, Better examples are ideals, like justice, right? Which might never be realized fully, and yet there's still some important sense in which we should attempt to achieve them, right? Um, Kant has a very interesting way of thinking about this and re-articulating Plato's ideas in these terms, right? Seeing an idea as something like an infinite task, right? A task that is kind of like iterated, right? But you see the idea as kind of like the iterative limit of this task. Um, uh, a kind of better example of this in the context of rational norms is again consistency, right? Like in some sense, reason is governed by norms of consistency and completeness, right? You should try and, you know as much as you can about the world. On the other hand, you should try and make sure that all your beliefs and representations of it are consistent, right? And neither of us, none of us, can ever have fully complete and consistent beliefs, right? Despite the fact that the process is governed by trying to aim at them, right? Um, so a kind of general way of characterizing normativity here is that the normative is anything to do with prescription, um, with anything that is like a standard of correctness or a standard of value. Um, um, Here are some problematic views of normativity. Um, some of these are taken from Robert Brandom. So Robert Brandom characterizes two positions he calls regulalism and regularism. Um, Regularism is the idea that um, norms are rules. So what that means is norms are always explicit principles, right? Sets of instructions, right? Um, this idea is pretty much cleanly undermined by Wittgenstein's rule following argument. The argument is basically, well, okay, if you've got a rule, right, how are you supposed to interpret it? Right? Oh, well, maybe there's a rule for how you interpret the rule, but then you need another rule to interpret the rule to interpret the rule, and this creates a kind of regress. Right? So there's got to be something undergirding the interpretation of the rule that is not itself a rule. Um, um, there's a lot of literature on this problem in analytic philosophy. Most famously, Kripke's book on Wittgenstein. Um, this is a kind of interesting example of what I was calling proceduralism earlier, because Kripke ultimately comes to the conclusion that kind of basically the correct way to understand a rule is the democratically agreed upon one. Like if it's basically like the community determines what, say, the addition function is, right? And if 50% or more of people think you should act in this way, then that's the correct way in which you should act. This is sort of like the simplest solution to the problem of what I'm going to call normative closure, but also just the worst one. But it sort of clearly instantiates this kind of like democratic thinking that Plato was opposed to, right? Regularism is the position that well, all there is to a norm is a regularity of behavior, right? So, like, look, people in England just on average eat with a fork on the left, right? That's the norm. It's just that pattern, right? Um, and this is a very tempting position to take, but it has the problem that it leaves the content of the norm sort of underdetermined, right? So there are cases where a norm, so to put it more cleanly, like sometimes um, the norm specifies behavior that has never been seen. Right? So there might be cases where, and a good example of this is like board game rules, right? I'm sure a lot of people have played board games before where you've got a set of complicated rules and you end up in a situation where the rules don't seem to explicitly say how it should be interpreted, right? Um, like, and there's got to be, in some sense, like, or at least we think the spirit of the game says we should go one way or the other, right? But if we're the first people to encounter this weird odd state, if it's never actually been achieved before, right? How are we supposed to know purely on the basis of regularities? Like, how did other people act within this situation? Um, this is really sort of significant in the case of language and linguistic norms, because like a huge amount of language, as per Chomsky, like are sentences that have never been said before, right? Like, so if our linguistic behavior is sort of norm governed, there are correct and incorrect ways to use words and to sort of infer from them, right? How are we supposed to um, uh, understand the way in which they should go if these are cases that have never been seen before? Um, now, um, what I'm calling the problem of normative closure is precisely how do you interpret the norm as covering every case it's supposed to cover? Like how do you interpret the rule going forward, right, on the basis of what has already happened, right? So this right, it specifies like a clear decision in every potentially ambiguous case. Um, there are several distinct problems in the analytic literature that essentially collapse down to this problem of normative closure. So Quine's work on the indeterminacy of translation and inscrutability of reference, right? Um, and perhaps less famously, Dretski's work on mental representations. So this is the idea that, like, functionalists want to say this state within the brain of a frog represents a fly, right? But what if there are situations where you fire like lead pellets past the frog and it swallows them, right? Do we want to say like that representation um, is a representation of anything that it will sort of put out its tongue for? How do we say that this is a state that is misrepresenting, right? So how do we understand there being a kind of standard of correctness implicit within that? And again, people want to say, well, there's something about the evolutionary history there, but it's very hard to get the evolutionary history to cover every possible case to achieve this kind of closure, right? Um, um, Two other positions I'm going to sort of introduce myself. There's um, what I've sometimes called um, normophobia, um, which is um, basically, I mean, it's of a piece with what I was calling kind of postmodern critiques before, and it's essentially this idea that all normative distinctions are in some sense oppressive, right? All normative distinctions are ultimately illicit, what symptoms of illicit authority. Um, I think this is a very pernicious way of thinking, and it's also very easy to refute, simply because the very notion of oppression requires some normative conception of freedom. Right? The distinction between freedom and oppression is itself a normative distinction. Um, Another perspective that is worth mentioning here is eliminativism. Less, it comes at things less from the normative side than from the causal side. So eliminativism basically says, look, there isn't such a thing as normativity. It's a kind of illusion. It's an epiphenomenon, right? All there is causal systems, um, and we should just eliminate normative notions from um, um, well, everything, like be it causal explanation or discussion of what we're supposed to do, right? Um, I really like an argument that Ray puts forward that I call Brassier's razor, which is essentially that explanation is itself fundamentally normative, right? Justification is itself a fundamentally normative notion, and um, to be an eliminativist consistently, right? There's no way of justifying the position because you eradicate the possibility of justification and explanation in the process. It's what I call suicide by parsimony. Um, right. Officially at around about an hour now, so I should try and do my best to wrap this up, but I've only got 2 slides left, so um, here are what I take to be sort of Brandam's really interesting insights into the relation between causality and normativity. First of all, expressivism. This is his way of sort of splitting the difference between regulism and regularism, right? So norms don't have to be explicit rules. They can be implicit in practice, right? Practices are what you might want to think of as self-sustaining regularities, right? Behavioral regularities. They're self-sustaining because they involve self-correction, right? So if you've got a social group of people, right, they don't necessarily have a written rule dictating behavior as long as they've got some internal conception of the way in which they should act and other people should act, and they correct one another, right? They don't have to be referring to a rule to do the correction. They can just have a sort of implicit sense. And but as long as you've got that, as far as Brandam's concerned, you have some kind of norm. and the rules are what make explicit what's already implicit within the practice. The second idea, I'm not sure if I should call this historicism, but I'm going to call it historicism. And this is basically that the problem of normative closure, this question of like how to make indeterminate norms fully determinate, is actually a matter of progressive determination, right? So, like, it doesn't matter that you didn't always have an answer to the question of, well, what to do in this weird edge case, right? As long as there's a way to determine that answer on the fly, like as you go, right? As long as there's ways of determining what to do within the edge cases, and these ways of determination are appropriately rational, right? Then we have normative closure of a kind. I mean, Brandom uses this example of sort of jurisprudence, how like judges have to both make new law and appeal to previous case law, right? So there's got to be the sense in which what they're doing is kind of rationally extending something that's already there. And they have to do it in a way which involves a kind of crucial rational argumentation. Right? This for him is the kind of exemplar of this sort of historical process of progressive determination, right? Where the meaning that was in some sense already implicit in the law is made explicit, right? Um, um, I think what this gives us is a kind of virtuous circularity in explaining the normative. So the normative isn't reduced to the causal, right, as it is in regularism or eliminativism, but at the same time, um, so the normative is explained in normative terms, but it's done in a virtuous rather than a vicious circle that articulates the relationship between the normative and the causal. So to sort of spell out the circularity, reason is normative, right? We've already said, like being consistent, like having, getting rid of inconsistent judgments. That's a sort of normative aspect of reason, right? But indeed, we could say drawing inferences in general is itself normative. Like there's some inferences you should draw from a proposition, certain inferences you shouldn't draw, right? Reason is inherently normative, but at the same time, norms are inherently rational, right? Norms are in some sense practical reasons, right? They give you reason to act within certain ways, right? It's understanding how these two things fit together, that's the virtuous circle, right? And my particular way I want to put a spin on this is to say practices, right? These self-correcting behavioral regularities in which norms are implicit, embody questions that regulate progressive determination, right? So when I was saying like when we enter a situation in which it's an edge case, we don't know how to go on, right? That's a question, right? There is this sort of sense of, okay, how do we proceed, right? Um, as long as um, there's the ability to engage within that questioning, right? Then there's the possibility of progressive determination, right? And this is a way of thinking about what I was saying about ideas at the beginning, right? This idea that, okay, well, in some sense, all we're doing is kind of playing a game, the rules to which we've agreed upon conventionally, right? We've instantiated a certain language game with rules that are used in a certain way, but we do that in such a way that we make ourselves beholden to standards that exceed what it is we're doing. So, sorry, that exceed um, the 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 conventions that we instantiated, right? So we get through the conventional to something that's beyond the conventional. Um, and yeah, I think this sort of Brandomian way of framing the issue um, gives us purchase on a sort of deep Platonic problem. Now, final comments. What is reason in a positive sense? I'm not going to rehash everything said in the end of Prometheus and rationalism, but I want to point out two different ways in which I've talked about reason here and elsewhere. In the Prometheanism rationalism, I very much kind of characterize reason in terms of information integration. I say it's the only in principle information integration and processing protocol. Right? The point of reason is, in some sense, it can be extended to process information about anything, such that you can sort of solve any problem, right? It's a kind of like representational definition. And crucially, the way I argue this is that extensibility, in order to sort of extend your sort of information storage and representation capacities to encompass new things, there's got to be the possibility of revising existing ones, right? So in principle extensibility leads to in principle revisability, right? And this is contra Bayesianism, not simply revision of beliefs, but revision of concepts, like not just sort of revision of premises and conclusions, but revision of the rules governing inference, right? I'll talk about this a lot more in detail in, I think, lecture 3. I am actually going to talk about the details of semantic inferentialism, but we'll put that off for now. So, okay, I have this sort of information integration picture of rationality, and this combines what I've described as my computational Kantianism and my minimalist Hegelianism, right? There's this conception of information integration involving a kind of relationship between consciousness and self-consciousness, right? The, pre-rational forms of information processing being sort of appropriated and adopted by the rational linguistic ones, right? And then there's this sort of minimalist Hegelian idea that the necessary revisability of the sort of linguistic layer of representation is in some sense implicitly social, right? Now, the other way of characterizing reason that I've adopted more recently, if anyone's come across it, I wrote this piece recently called Geist in the Machine, and I'll give a link to it on the Google group. There, I've increasingly talked about in terms of what I call wisdom. And I define this as the capacity to utilize intelligence. So again, in this kind of consciousness, self-consciousness model, there's this idea that we have various sort of pre-rational capacities for solving different kinds of problems, multiple intelligences, if you will. What's key is our ability to utilize those, to represent the problems that we are faced with in such a way that we can deploy the resources at our disposal to process information and solve them, right? The key feature of wisdom, as far as I'm concerned, is the ability to not just to formulate, but to reformulate problems. Because most problems are ill-defined, right? And often it's changing the way we understand the problem that enables us to solve it. This is essentially the same thing as what I call at the beginning, asking better questions, right? So, um, and I think fundamentally this is importantly the same thing as this capacity for revision. So this is a more kind of practical rather than theoretical or representational way of talking about the same thing. And connecting this to the third in my trinity of self-descriptors, this is a kind of, well, to frame this as a heretical Platonism, this kind of capacity to ask better questions in a way that has a kind of progressive trajectory, right? Which is sort of connected to this kind of Hegelian sociality, right? Is kind of interfacing with the idea, right? Is being, having, so in this sense, reason is the capacity to engage with these practices that incarnate questions that can um, 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 through a kind of process of progressive revision um, exceed or transcend the conventions and definitions that they start with. Right, that's basically it. I'll do one final thing, which is I'm gonna show you a diagram, a mysterious diagram that is what I'm working on in terms of how how I'm trying to develop this heretical Platonism. So one thing you may see throughout the book and the different essays is I'm very much committed to what I call the Platonic trinity of cardinal values: beauty, right, and truth. At least those are the way I'd articulate. Some people would say beauty, truth, and goodness. I like to say goodness is the genus and right is the species alongside beauty and truth. So here's the diagram. Um, um, my work going forward is trying to make sense of these and their relation to one another. And also and an aspect of this that's already implicit within the book in various essays is an idea that there's a kind of split between a sort of formal and a substantive version of each value, right? So there's a kind of sense in which you can talk about right within ethics and also aesthetics and also in science, right? Or you can say that there's truths that are ethical truths or aesthetic truths, right? And equally, you might be able to talk about types of beauty or excellence within science and ethics, right? But each of these things also has a kind of substantive domain that's its own. So, the domain of right is ethics, the domain of beauty is art, the domain of truth is science. So, um, I'll explain this more when we get to the relevant essays, but this is the thing I'm working on. And in some sense, it's meant to be a kind of theory of ideas. Like what I want to be able to say is that there's some sense in which in order to understand ideas, and there are ideas that belong to each sort of domain, right? There are mathematical ideas, there are aesthetic ideas, there's ethical ideas, right? Um, um, but in order to properly understand ideas as such, you need to be able to view them from all three perspectives, right? Um, I don't know how much of this theory I'm going to be able to develop within this course, but I thought I'd give you a taste of where things are going. And hopefully you can see how we might get to this kind of place from the sort of concerns we started with in the essays that I sent. Okay, I'm gonna stop that there. Oh, right. How are people doing? Good. Hope that made some kind of sense. And I know we already have some questions we want to come back to. I'm going to suggest um, we take a 5 minute break. Is that okay? Yeah, five. Hopefully
Course.
we'll do more like 10 in future, but I'm managing my time badly here. So take a 5 minute break. We'll come back. We'll do the nasty bureaucracy stuff, and then we'll just get into discussion. Okay? Right. Catch you guys shortly. Okay, I realized I forgot to actually set myself a timer. So I think that's about 5 minutes. Is everyone okay? Great. Um, oh, so um, before we get into full-on discussion, um, I just want to deal with the little bit of bureaucracy we need to do first. So I think there are about so we've got 37 people here, so about 35 people, actual students maybe, uh, depending on how many new center accounts there are in. Um, and I think there are about 46 people signed up for the course in total. Um, that probably means we can't do a round, everybody introduce themselves, because if we do that, we'll not have any time left. Um, what we do have to work out is um, class presentations. Um, there's sort of there's 7 sessions left. Um, and basically our options are we can have one presentation per session done by 6 people, or 2 presentations per session done by 3 people apiece. And we can either have those presentations done directly in class, or people can arrange and record them prior to the classes. We can watch them prior to the classes and then discuss them in time at the end. Um, I think it's probably best if we had 2 groups of 3 per week recording in advance. Um, oh yeah, sorry. Someone's pointed out that's certificate students, um, not necessarily everybody. My maths might be wrong here. Um, so there's still mostly certificate students here. So I think more or less groups of 2 or 3 is still going to be what works out. Um, um, anyway, basically, um, I think other people actually understand how the grading system works better than I do. Sorry, I need to get my head around this. As I say, things have changed quite a lot since I first started teaching here. Um, anyway, what I'm going to suggest is, if it's okay, people can self-organize into groups for doing presentations. And what we'll do is um, basically 2 slots a week. And if you want to claim a slot, we'll sort it out in the WhatsApp group. Does that sound good? Yep, Alina?
Mm. So you mentioned a WhatsApp group, but I don't think any of us is in there.
Oh, I thought it was. Let's do the Discord.
Okay,
Is that better?
yeah, that works.
Yeah. The Discord's going to be much better. Um,
Right, so we said groups of 3, right?
yeah,
And the presentation should be like what, like 10 minutes or
10 minutes basically. Um, someone's asking if you could submit written text. I don't have a problem with that, but I'm not sure what the guidelines say. So let me get back to you on that. Um, Um, but basically, if we can, outside of the lecture in the Discord, get this all sorted together, I think that would be best because then we've got um um is there a link to the Discord? There should be. Can someone else sort that link? Can some kind Samaritan link Felipe?
I don't think we can link unless someone here is a moderator in the Discord. If you don't
Uh,
have a link, maybe email student service. Yeah, just like Grayson said, email
email
student
student
service.
services, great. Um, okay, great. So that's the bit of bureaucracy I wanted to do. I also characteristically talked longer than I should have. So let's try and get as much discussion as we can do, possibly do now. Um, um, okay, Alina,
Just something very quick before we move to discussion. The presentations, you want them to be like on the readings or on anything related to the topic or
honestly, I am super permissive.
okay.
Like, like the other thing I should say is I know I've set my own book for this, and that's like fairly, narcissistic. Like, I'm happy for people to go and find other material that's related. In fact, I'm happy to recommend other sources, like bits of random sellers, other things that I'm engaged with. Like, totally happily for you to do that. Um, yeah, just go mad. Um,
Ah, cool.
um, Nicola,
Oh, hello. If if we can start with the discussion, or we are also, I mean, if we are talking about the stuff, the logistic of this seminar. If is the later, I can wait because it's a question about the content.
I think we're okay to get
All
into
right,
content.
all right. First of all, I apologize because English is not my native language, so it could be difficult to express myself. But the thing is, I don't know. I think that it is a kind of paradox. I don't know if you say if you see that as I see, but the thing is, I have a struggle with this computation, the transcendental psychology, Kant, is a kind of universal description about the reason. And also, we try to combine with the idea that the reason is constrained, is embedded in the world, and also then the normative is a practical reason. So I have this difficulty to understand how it's possible to to uh, make an universal description and also have this a particular yeah, I hope that you can understand it.
No, no, I do understand. I
Thank you.
think anyway. And um, it, it's a real challenge, right? Um, a lot of people, uh, maybe a majority of people, will want to say that what I've called like incarnation and interaction there, these two features of the way in which reason has to be kind of embedded within the world, right, preclude functional abstraction. They'll want to say um, there's um, got to be some sort of thick notion of embodiment, right? Or even as simple as something like Searle would say, like, you need actual biological matter and it's got some primitive properties that enable intentionality, and you can't abstract away from that. You can't just have um, um, it's a challenge I've got to meet. I think the key thing for me is that, and I think this is something we will, I mean, the next session is going to be on computational Kantianism, so we can go through this in a bit more depth. The key thing for me is that a concrete process of rational inquiry, right? Think of it a bit like a peer-to-peer network, right? Like people can join the peer-to-peer network with different clients running on different hardware, right? Like as long as you fit the standards of the protocol, right? The the thing that you're running in order to connect can be all sorts, right? But there's still something essentially concrete about what that network as a whole is doing and getting up to, right? There is something concrete about how that network is being constrained by the world and how it's forcing it to evolve and develop, right? But the the nodes of the network that are getting things out of that, as well as enacting the constraints, uh, can potentially change the way in which that they are realizing their connection to it, right? Without fundamentally destroying its its key properties, the way in which it's tracking. So to move away from the peer-to-peer network metaphor, the way in which, say, a scientific research program, right, is tracking reality through engaging with experimental apparatuses and, doing various different like theoretical debates internally, right? Like the way in which a progressive scientific research program is tracking the world can be continuous even as everybody involved within that that scientific research program is replaced with a computational instance doing something fairly similar, right? Like the the overall rational patterns can be engaged with the world because even as the way in which they're engaged with the world shifts and changes. Does that make some kind of sense? Like basically I'm sort of saying against people who want to insist on some kind of thick embodiment, right? That thick embodiment's doing nothing interesting or discernible in the case of something like a scientific research program, right? You might want to claim at the level of the individual, oh, you need this thick embodiment to be able to understand what red is or whatever the fuck it is, right? But at the level of the sort of like social process that's carrying out the evolution of the idea, right? Thick embodiment's not doing anything, right? Um,
So,
right.
sorry, in that case, you are talking about a kind of process, a kind of proceduralism.
Proceduralism. Yes. Um, yeah, so, and this is where my own critique of proceduralism comes back to bite me. Like, what I need to be able to do is to say that these things are genuinely engaging with the world. It's not just some kind of consensus that's not constrained. So I still have to be able to explain constraint, and what I'm calling normative closure, right? But we'll get to that hopefully. Someone has a question about David Roden. Yeah. I've not read that particular David Roden piece,
Yeah,
but
I don't think I read it some time ago, and I thought it was very interesting. It's a critique of a very short piece by Ray called "Unfree Improvisation,"
yeah,
and it's beyond my kind of ability to properly explain because it deals with a lot of musical theory. But it talks about jazz improvisation, and it basically suggests that norms are not a good way to think about the range of freedom and the kinds of creativity involved in jazz improvisation, and suggests that the idea of norms as something that prescribe rather than describe what actually happens, or the range of expectations or the range of variabilities, doesn't work very well in that context. And then it tries to generalize it more, to apply it more widely using predictive processing as a model for understanding cognition. I think I'd need to reread it again. It was just when you were running through your the regulism versus regalism, and the way that gets resolved through a kind of expressivist conception of norms being implicit in practice, but then being self-correcting. I think it's quite an interesting critique of that, but like I say, I'm not really in a position to go over it now.
So Roden is, I think, in the eliminativist camp.
Yeah, definitely.
And he wrote a piece on Brandom and normativity called Brandom's Burdens years ago, which I always meant to write a critique of, but never got round to. So maybe I should go away and see if I can read those two, and it would be interesting to have some engagement with that. I think my response to David was always that he just didn't understand this point about progressive determination. That he gives like the indeterminacy critique. He's like, oh, there's no way to achieve normative closure, therefore norms don't exist. We should get rid of that way of thinking. I mean, I don't know how this plays out in the context of improvisation, but basically, like, we should get rid of this conception of normativity. And my response has always been, as long as we can make sense of the idea of progressive determination. What I think in one of my slides, I compared it. I didn't actually say this out loud. It's a bit like lazy evaluation in programming. It's like, as long as like the next element of the list is available when you need to actually do something with it, everything is fine, right? And that's kind of my sort of kind of computational take on that. And so yeah, I think there can be like a computationalist response to Rodin's eliminativism, but it'd be cool to engage with it in more depth.
Could you stick that Brandon Spurden article somewhere so that we can have a look at it, and then
Yeah,
I can read that again? Because I never read that. I couldn't get hold of it at the time, I think.
let me see if I can find it. Um, is it called Brandon's Burdens? I will find it. What I should say, another thing I should mention is the Google Classroom isn't working for me yet. So maybe I'll have to put things in the Discord for now. But I will find it and I will put it up. And if I don't, just poke me, send me an email, and I'll make sure to get it done. Oh, has someone already found it? Okay. Marvelous. Okay, Alina.
I think the question in the chat was first, one by Felipe. Um,
Oh, okay. Sorry. Um, okay. Is maths a human con something of a human construct? Um, I think maths is the best example of the kind of dynamic that I'm interested in, which is something that is a construct becoming more than a mere construct. Like, there's definitely a sense in which mathematics is constructed, at least insofar as like we have to actually build deductive frameworks, right? Like we have to choose a particular kind of syntax to represent certain things, right? But um, we end up learning things beyond the mere choices, like the contingent choices that we've made in setting up that framework, right? And mathematics is it gives really great ways of talking about this because it's so kind of precise. So, like, we can find out that two completely independent syntactic frameworks correspond. And so we can use them as two different perspectives upon the same thing, right? And it's that kind of parallax that gives us this idea of, oh, well, there is a thing that these different perspectives are getting a grip on, right? This idea of something kind of like beyond the mere perspective or the mere sort of syntactic construction. Um, but we can hopefully use some more concrete examples of these in future in future lectures. Um, and it's constructivism is still a respectable position to take. I just think it's wrong. Alina.
right. So that question I had earlier. So it feels like when you talk about this dynamic of refining concepts and so on, it makes me think of practical kinds in philosophy of psychiatry. So the idea is, yeah, you start with some initial category, and then over time, as you figure out what works and what doesn't work, gets it changes and adapts to practice. I think my worry here is, while it is true that you might be tending towards something in that process of refinement, it's not clear to me um, that it's not clear to me like what you're tending to is something that you might call truth necessarily. I think in psychiatry will tend to just whatever works best in that particular context. Um, and depending on the practice, it will tend to different places. So different practices will valorize different kinds of states, and whatever categories happen to be most useful in those circumstances will be the ones that kind of you're going to tend towards. So if I'm navigating around my neighborhood, the notion of topological spaces is really not useful to me. And the notion of like a simple intuitive physical space really is useful to me. So I don't really think anytime in the near future people are going to start talking about coming to see a movie in terms of topological spaces. But yeah,
I mean, I would say just as I get the point, but like a really pithy counterexample would be look at any tube map for like an underground trailing system, and that's a topological, not a metric space.
yeah. Although it's true, people don't really see it as a topological space. They don't have in
Yeah,
their
I
minds.
understand.
Yeah.
It was a kind of pithy, like the more serious response. And hopefully, when we talk about the essay on transcendental realism, we'll get into this in like more deep terms. Is um, so like first of all, I think there is this difference between sort of generic truth or formal truth and objective truth, right? So I think we have truth wherever there's this attempt to kind of get at some kind of attitude independence, to sort of try and create some standard that's like independent of any of our attitudes about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that standard is fully independent, right? Um, an objective truth is a sort of ideal of absolute attitude independence, and it's harder for us to implement a kind of discursive structure within which we're kind of stay true to that. And there are various ways that that can fail, right? So first of all, it would be like, yeah, okay, the the kind of discourse we're engaged in could just like fail at objectivity. It could fall back on something that we can still kind of call truth, but it's not really um, objective. Um, the more complicated answer, which is something I don't do in the SM transcendental realism, but have increasingly come to think since. So one of the few bits of Aristotle I actually think is really good is he has a conception of degrees of reality in terms of explanatory power, right? So like in Aristotle, as for a lot of like pre-modern thinkers, reality is not like you're either real or you're not. It's like you can be more or less. And what's more real is what plays a more fundamental explanatory role, right? So like from this perspective, I think you could talk about sort of degrees of objectivity in terms of like, okay, well, we've got like a kind of workable model of something, right? And it enables us to practically navigate around these things in these contexts, right? But it doesn't necessarily explain a whole lot of other things. And then there might be like more detailed models of different phenomena that are, so like you might think of like Newtonian mechanics versus Einsteinian general relativity, where like, yeah, okay, Einsteinian general relativity is deeper and it explains this, but Newtonian mechanics is much more useful if you want to get around the solar system, right? Just computationally, right? We can think about things like that in terms of uh, degrees of explanatory power, but it's this is something I need to work out in more detail. So it's a really, really good question, and I would like to engage with that more specifically. So if we can hold that for I think it's the minimalist Hegelianism week, I think we can talk about it in a lot more depth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is very helpful. So I think like what I'm calling practical kinds are instances where you're calling here like a formal truth. And do you have in mind that a substantive truth is impossible to obtain? Is like a regulative ideal, infinite process kind of thing you
So
said?
yes, so I mean, basically, really what I give is a theory, not so much of truth as of truth aptness.
Hmm.
So like whether or not a judgment is susceptible to assessment of a certain and basically I think objective truth is about a certain kind of truth aptness. It's like we can say that like a progressive research program is striving for objective truth, right? And we can describe a degenerative research program in terms of the ways in which it is failing to strive in that way, if that makes sense.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
um, um, Etta? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right,
So,
sorry.
no, it's all right, it's all right. This is a very broad question because I am not very familiarized with neorationalism, and I'm taking this seminars and other ones in order to be more to know more in a more deep way what neorationalism means. But I would like to ask a question about the metaphysical statements of neorationalism and all this new account of what reason is. because the rationalistic tradition, it's very famous for Cartesian dualism, mind-body, etc. And this is something that I think in my research I try to counter, because I'm trying to think questions about ecology and biology in a manner that defies this dualistic understanding. And I see that there are a lot of from the very minimal things that I've read from neorationalism, I see that there is a kind of lineage from pragmatism, or at least some version of it, is which is a point of contact with what I'm currently working right now. And I know that pragmatism is also a there are some appropriations of pragmatism that want to question the the dualism, or the dualisms of modern metaphysics. And so, yeah, I would like to know what is the metaphysical account of Prometheanism and
So,
neorationalism.
so crucially, like my first book is a book on what metaphysics is, or more likely what it isn't. And the essay on transcendental realism, the minimalist Hegelianism week, will talk a bit more about what I take metaphysics to be. Crucially, I think metaphysics is continuous with natural science. So I think metaphysics is a posteriori, right? Um, but in that, you could say my metaphysical commitments are very much materialist. Like I'm a not a dualist. I don't think the job of metaphysicians should be to come along and insert like um ad hoc primitives in order to make various other kinds of explanation work, right? Particularly if they detract from kind of like the systematic unity of science. So this is where I'm very opposed to. Okay, here's where there might be a bit of a challenge, right? So, um, um, both myself and Ray Brassier are very anti-vitalist, and we're anti-vitalist on this kind of metaphysical ground of thinking that vitalism has a tendency to want to inject some metaphysical primitives that are unnecessary, right? Like to explain mindedness in terms of like some primitive kind of organismal agency. And there'll be a week when I'm going to attack that quite strongly. Um, but again, you might disagree, and that's fine. The other thing I would say is, but the key thing is 2 points. For me, metaphysics comes after epistemology. I'm like epistemology first, metaphysics afterwards. Secondly, the point about pragmatism, my big pragmatist influence is Robert Brandom. But although he will count himself as part of the pragmatist tradition, there are many people who are really into like James and Peirce and other pragmatist thinkers who think he's a bit of a kind of Johnny come lately who doesn't really engage properly with the American pragmatists. So there are connections, but they're maybe not as strong as they could be. Um, but if you wanted to write something on that, or you want to give a presentation about pragmatism and this sort of thing, totally happy for it. Really, really interested. Ryan.
Uh, Excuse me. Yeah, so I kind of had a question about expressivism, and maybe Brandom has an answer to that. Answer to this, I'm not well read in Brandom, but we have this idea that norms are implicit and self-correct correcting practices, and the social group of having this internal conception of how we should act, and it's sort of mutually self-correcting. And I guess I'm wondering if this in itself has the potential to degenerate into an infinite regress of sorts in terms of how these implicit norms, how we can find sort of an origin for them. And I wonder if, that origin can possibly make recourse to, I don't know, psychoanalysis, Freud, and sort of the idea of this mutually reinforcing structures of individuals existing in a social symbolic register. But I guess I wonder if there's a virtuous circle that we can pull out of this instead of kind of letting it devolve into this vicious one.
So it's a really good question. 2 points. The parallel with Lacan is something that a lot of people have noticed. This question of like the symbolic has to kind of come from somewhere, right? And there's like a lot of parallels between the Salesian Brandomian story and the Lacanian one. Different semantics, but very similar. Like even down to like the form of law. Like in order to get in the symbolic, you've got to have law, you've got to have normativity, right? Um, um, the regress in the Brandomian story that most people point out, and I think this is what you're probably getting at, is this like Brandom's story is kind of recognitive. Like he basically thinks that like normative statuses are implemented by mutual recognition, right? So it's like I recognize you as having a normative status of this kind, and you recognize me as and this does create like a kind of a a kind of need for a myth of origin, like how do you get the community starting, right? If there's already got to be a community in order to. Um, I think Brandom's own way of articulating this is sometimes the problem. I don't want to say but I think I think he has good and bad instincts on it, and you can follow his good instincts. To frame the problem in its most general terms, basically, there's two ways of conceiving of sociality in relational terms, either as like I, we, or I, thou. It's like my relationship to the community or my relationship to another individual. And the 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 I, we kind of relationship is very much the kind of Habermasian story of sociality, right? And this is where you end up with like things like, well, we need a prior consensus at a communal level. There's got to be this kind of like, this is where we get the kind of what I've called reasonableness, right? Um, the better story is the I thou story is is describing the kind of abstract structure of sociality and how that builds up into communities from individual interaction. And I think if you tell that story correctly, you can tell it in terms of capacities. And so you don't need there to already be social norms in order for anyone to get into the game. But it's tricky, right? There are a lot of ways to trip up when telling this kind of story, and I do think Brandon does trip up in some of these ways. So it's a really, really perceptive question and a really interesting issue to pursue further. Um, Yeah. Good point, Lena. Right. Arnab.
Uh, mm, 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 Thank you for the great presentation and the lecture, Professor. It was very engaging. I was thinking of a particular um, like, the question that I had, because my research, I'm a theology student, continental theology. So my research is on rituals and reality. How ritualistic behavior shapes and reshapes reality. So regarding that, I was thinking that uh, 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 is the questions that were raised before, uh, like implicit norms, is is the characteristics of the um, like norms uh, and mathematics which we develop or imbibe from the outside, if or from each other, we construct as such. Uh, is it possible that uh, there's a uh, these realities uh, are actually out there as fields, and we receive them when we become conscious? Is there such a worldview, or if there is, what is this worldview called? Because I came across this a number of times, especially the remote viewing by Ingo Swann, uh, that we basically receive our characteristics as through our consciousness as pre-existing fields, something like panpsychism in case of in case of like consciousness.
Yeah, panpsychism is the sort of thing you're looking for. Um, like I'm very much not a consciousness guy. Um, what's around the concept of consciousness is done. Um, but it might be that panpsychism is what you're looking for. If you've looked, I don't know if you've come across Philip Goff's stuff. He's sort of
Yes,
like
yes,
the,
Professor. I've read him.
yeah. Um, um, how this would relate to norms. So one thing I will say is that there is, and again, I'm totally opposed to this, but there is a whole kind of literature about the sort of re-enchantment of nature, which tries to see sort of
Right, right.
normativity as being inherent within the world and as being revealed through conscious experience. Um, the thing is some of it's quite sort of anti-metaphysical at the same time. So like a good example is like John McDowell, who wants to do this kind of Wittgensteinian therapeutic, oh well, we can just see the kind of norms within nature. We can just see that things are all right, but we shouldn't like read anything more into that, which is what you'd be doing if you're going into kind of panpsychism and things like this. Um, but I think there might be some more metaphysically friendly stuff on the re-enchantment of nature. There was definitely a lot of this as part of like new materialism about 10 years
Yes,
ago.
yes.
So if you look into kind of new materialist authors, you might find some of that as well. So, but yeah, I think look at the re-enchantment of nature, check new materialism, see overlaps with panpsychism. That sound good?
Absolutely, Professor. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No problem. Sasha.
Yeah, I think that my question is going to piggyback off of Ryan's to a certain extent. At the beginning of the lecture, you sort of pose is neo-rationalism like necessarily a Prometheanism? I think I want to ask, is it necessarily an anti-fascism? And I want to describe, I think I want to like pin down fascism as a nihilance, like a nihilism of potesta. Right, the sort of brutal execution of power on the part of a powerful group for its own sake. And here, I think I also want to bring in like Kant avec Sade, right? The notion that there's a libidinality behind.
I'm just plugging in my laptop, by the way. I'm listening, so
okay,
carry on.
Yeah, within like Elek, especially in like late Fisher's work, right? Like we see a political commitment to collectivity of potentia and joy. Yeah, I wonder if you think that neo-rationalism has within it a sufficient seed to resist, again, this kind of like nihilism of potesta, right, as a kind of maximization of its own good.
Very good question. So one of the things that has been pointed out to me before about the Prometheanism and rationalism piece is that I just kind of say, like, what do we need to do if we want to have an egalitarian philosophy? And like, I never justify, like, why should we be egalitarian? Right? That is actually like a really key underdeveloped part of this story that I'm wanting to tell about why a certain conception of reason implies a certain conception of freedom. I think that the answer to it has to be something like Kant's answer. And again, like Kant is dodgy in many ways, right? But basically Kant wants to say something like the conception of practical reason that he develops, like when you understand practical reason fully, you essentially have to understand it from something like a selfless perspective, right? So there's this is very much the way in which I don't know if you've come across Adrian Piper. Really interesting figure, Kantian philosopher, studied under Jordan Rawls, also really, really famous performance artist. And she kind of connects Kant to Indian and Buddhist philosophy of mind, where there's this kind of conception of mind that's not necessarily self-oriented. And I think basically that's the kind of direction. I mean, the question is, how do you articulate this kind of like suppression of ego, right? Like Rawls does it in terms of the original position, which everybody in his dog has an objection to, right? So like if it is a kind of open question for me how best to articulate this, but there has to be a sense in which like if you go the full hog as a rationalist, you inevitably have to kind of subordinate your own interests to those of others. How that's done is, again, it's tricky. It's basically like how to get Kant right, and everyone's been trying to do that for like 200 years. And I think even like Mark Fisher would see something like this. Like I think his cold rationalism ultimately is a very different take on the same idea, right?
Yeah.
So like I'm much more in favor of like personhood and personality as a notion than Fisher and Brassier were. But I think there is still this like aspect of like impersonal reason that there is in their work that's really kind of like good and has got to be seized on and articulated correctly. I hope that answers the question.
I mean, I do think I hear you saying that like it's a space of continued development within the Neorationalist like program, right? Yeah. I mean, I really, I think I was reading Revenge of Reason around the same time that I was like digging into like Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? And there's a certain kind of way I think that I'm, like reading Revenge of Reason in the context of like Wilhelm Reich's just like famous question on, like why does fascism happen? And I think I'm trying to trace how it is that, again, neo-rationalism can be an emancipatory project, as opposed to in a certain way just being a hypercharged plane of reference, always already like actualizing what is already in the sequence of actualization.
I mean, I think the key thing is one fundamental part of it is, and I emphasize this, is this anti-normative naturalism or normative anti-naturalism. It's like fundamental commitment for me. And I know we'll see in some further lectures how I try and work that out, and I think that's a key vector or a key component of any functional anti-fascism. Anyway, Alina?
I already asked a question, so maybe Maria can go first.
Okay, Maria?
I'm sorry, I have struggle finding the toggle button for my mic. Can you hear me correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think I had a question, like one question, but the more you were talking, the more you were discussing, like it evolved. It like bifurcated a bit. So I'm going to be like throwing some thoughts first. The original question, which is like there's a moment when you talk about random and this practice of self-sustaining regularities, practices embody questions that regulate progressive determination, and this may just be a language game, but I was like before you made that statement, I was thinking, is it something embody questions that regulate progressive determination or that progressively regulates determination? And why like this seems like a, I don't know, like minor difference, but I was thinking about, because that made me ask another question, like the determination, the nature of determination. Is it a constraint? Is it a focus? Is it necessarily something that is itself progressively being reoriented? I don't know, I just, that sparked into my mind and I haven't been able to get it out, so I'm throwing that. And also I sort of was thinking about this counter argument you put to eliminativism, which is like explanation or justification is self-normative. And although I kind of on first hand agree with it, at the same time I'm thinking, like, this makes me think about the premises of, like, when we talk about these types of definitions of something being normative and that itself being normative, it's something that takes account time. Like, for example, is it some statement or some explanation is normative as in a, I don't know if the correct word is transcendental, if it's just like eternal. I don't think like you necessarily want to involve that, but I was thinking, like, is it transitive or is it like I cannot like help myself to think about this in a time perspective. I'm sorry, I have not the precise words, but yeah, this difference between something is normative, something is being normative, and when it can, like, it always is like that,
or can it cease to be within this normative framework? I guess I'm just still a bit confused about that. And the final question, I think, has to do more with what Sasha was saying about, but I'm going to take it more from how you ended up about impersonal reason. I'm thinking about the subject of rationalism. Is what you said, rationalism involves subordinating oneself to others, or is it actually recognizing how you are made of others? Because why I'm saying this is because I guess my premise would be that norms are collectively constructed, and that collectivity is itself something that is, I don't think it's a regression, but rather like in scales. You know, like a body is made of other bodies, are made of other bodies, and so on. And that itself is those scales and those phases are themselves built and constructed through time. So there is like this progressivist. I guess I'm trying to say that I'm this idea of progressivism is taking into account all of those dimensions when explaining itself, when trying to assert itself. Is that also taking the construction of that subject as also being progressively made?
If I can go in reverse, right? Great questions. So I think empirically, right, there's definitely a sense in which we are like constructed socially through other people. Like this is and I think like Rez's work is the most kind of sort of clear development of this in Intelligence and Spirit, where he's very clear, like, look, reason is a kind of social thing. Geist is this sort of like social thing that we kind of come into. And I think empirically that is true. Like, we human beings are like incredibly intellectually dependent upon the sort of like conceptual network of stuff we tap into, using this metaphor of the peer-to-peer network earlier. But I'm not sure this is the case transcendentally, and that's where I'm kind of I try and be careful. Like, I think theoretically there might be other forms of life that were less social than we are and less dependent, right? Now, I think there would be some sense in which any form of life is kind of implicitly social. Like, there is this kind of social dimension to rationality that is kind of intrinsic, but it's a kind of formal sociality. And so I don't want a kind of, I don't want to go from there to a kind of like transcendental ethical claim about sort of mutual constitution of every possible form of life, right? This is another area where I think Brandom is like a little bit too careless. Like, Brandom goes straight into Hegel and like Hegelian ethical life, like Sittlichkeit and things like this, where I kind of want to go, maybe we have to be wary of just how specific human sociality is. Like concretely, yes, humans totally interdependent, but the point about progression and my use of the term progressive, really, really incisive, because it is a term I'm using. It's doing a lot of work for me, and I'm not necessarily defining it very carefully. So another way to put the worry might be that I'm saying the thing that gets you to kind of like normative closure on some kind of standard, right? Which makes the standard kind of more than just the kind of like conventions or behavior of the social group, is this kind of process of progressive determination, and yet progressive is itself a normative, or can be read as a normative term. Like when I say something like a progressive scientific research program, that is a normative assessment, like from Lakatos, by the way. It's progressive research program versus a degenerative research program, right? So in some sense, I'm saying, oh, there's already this kind of like sense of normativity to the way in which the process is developing, unless I can cash that out, like unless I can describe what progressive means here in a way that doesn't appeal to the emergent normative standard I'm trying to explain, then I'm fucked, right? So like very, very good point. All I can say is I need to be a bit more careful, and I think I can do that, but it is a real problem. There was an intervening question between those two that I've kind of lost purchase on. But we don't have much time, so I'm just going to go to other people who have questions. I think these are going to have to be the last ones, guys. So, Ryan or Alina, sorry again.
I mean, I'm fine with Ryan taking the last because yeah, I already asked. So
Go for it, Ryan.
Yeah, so I have a question about the nature of revision and how it relates to abstraction. And maybe this is actually a lot of the previous questions sort of rolled up, but how does, or is there a systematic account of how revision in any kind of system would work at a different layer of abstraction than it is made on? So if there is a layer of abstraction that reason does its job and we make a revision, how does that translate to a different layer of abstraction?
Oh, so I think some of this, something, bear in mind, like I use revision both for theoretical and practical revision, and those end up being somewhat like analogous, but not entirely analogous. That's the kind of like the real gambit of the book is like we can use our way of thinking about theoretical revision to think about practical revision, but it gets a little bit hairy. The account of theoretical revision is this account of like conceptual revision as being the sort of like the killer app of language. Right? It's like this is what language enables us to do. In the lecture on Inhumanism and the reformatting of Homo sapiens, we'll talk about this more. And I do describe what goes on there, at least at the theoretical level, as being about different levels of abstraction. Because basically what I say is what language enables us to do is to repurpose like pre-rational cognitive mechanisms for other uses, right? So like a stupid example is like okay, it's actually a good example, albeit a weird one. Once had an interesting conversation with Gabriel Catran, who's a philosopher and physicist, and he said he thinks about quantum states like harmonies. So he thinks about it in like auditory terms, right? So he has like an intuitive grip on objects that we have no direct intuition of, right? Like this is like they're purely unobservable, conceptually articulated representation, but like he's repurposed aspects of his imagination to be able to deal with those inferential structures intuitively, right? So that's an example of like, yeah, there's a sense in which this like higher level of abstraction stuff enables us to repurpose and modify stuff below. And I think there's something similar going on at the practical level in terms of I sometimes call this expression and impression. And I think like psychoanalysis is basically gives us the best examples where it's like we have to interpret the drives, that we have to somehow like articulate at the conceptual symbolic level, like what it is the drives are aiming at. But doing that is kind of like re-articulating the content in a way that then reimposes itself upon the underlying like lower level representational mechanisms. And that process is kind of productive. Right. So yeah, I think we can talk about this, and all of this stuff is like connected to this Kantian account of the relationship between consciousness and self-consciousness. This idea that like self-consciousness is defined by this like rational inferential layer, right? But like most of what's going on is conscious, and it's a question of how it gets fed through and modified by that. I hope this is a decent. Is this making sense as an answer to your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Good. And again, we will talk about it more. Yeah. Was that one last point from Phil? No. Okay, guys. I've had a blast. Thank you for being really attentive and having really excellent questions. I'm going to do my best to keep myself within an hour next week. Maybe even less. Let's see. And hopefully we can have more discussions, and it doesn't just have to be me answering questions. Hopefully we can have back and forth. I know it's hard to do with this many people, but you know, the more of that we can get, the better. So I'll see yous on the Discord channel when it exists, and on the Google Classroom when it exists. Feel free to post questions and stuff. I'll do my best to answer and engage. And like I say, if you want recommendation for readings and stuff that aren't in my book, I will happily provide them. Like I can point people at the Brandom for the regularism stuff if you're interested in that, and so on and so forth. Right. Um, yeah.